June 25th, 2009, 12:21 p.m., Los Angeles. A 911 call comes in from a mansion on North Carrollwood Drive. The caller is frantic. The voice on the other end of the line says, one sentence that will change music history forever. He's not breathing. 4 hours later, the man on that bed, the same man who had sold out 50 nights at London's O2 Arena before a single show had even happened, the same man who once made the entire planet moonwalk in unison, was gone. But here's the part nobody talks about. 12 hours before that call, Michael Jackson was dancing, laughing, rehearsing Thriller like it was 1983 all over again. His choreographer said he was grinning from ear to ear. His crew hugged him goodnight. Nobody, not his dancers, not his doctor, not his own children sleeping down the hall, had any idea that the king of pop had less than 12 hours left on this earth. This is the story of those final hours, hour by hour, minute by minute. And by the end of this video, you'll understand something far bigger than what happened to Michael Jackson. You'll understand what happens to almost anyone who keeps pushing their body past the point their body was ever built to survive. Stay till the end, because the last 3 minutes of this video are the part nobody wants to admit is true. Before we get into it, let me ask you something. Have you ever pushed yourself so hard, for a job, for a dream, for a deadline, that you stopped listening to your own body? You told yourself, just one more night, just one more push. I'll rest after this is over. Now imagine doing that not for one deadline, but for 45 years. Imagine being famous since you were 5 years old. Imagine never once in your life being allowed to just be tired without the whole world watching. That was Michael Jackson's entire existence. From the Jackson 5 stage in Gary, Indiana, to Motown showcases, to selling over 400,000 tickets for a comeback tour in a matter of hours, this was a man who had not had a single normal night's sleep in decades. And in the summer of 2009, at 50 years old, with the whole world waiting for him to prove he could still be the greatest entertainer alive, his body finally reached its limit. This isn't just a celebrity death story. This is a warning. Because what happened to Michael Jackson can happen, in smaller, quieter ways, to anyone who refuses to rest. Let's go back to the beginning of his last day alive. It started like almost every other day of that summer. Michael Jackson was living in a rented French chateau-style mansion in the Holmby Hills neighborhood of Los Angeles, a temporary home while he prepared for the biggest comeback of his career, a 50-date residency titled This Is It at London's O2 Arena. The first show was scheduled for July 8th. Every ticket for the entire run had sold out almost instantly. Early that Wednesday afternoon, Jackson came downstairs and sat with his 3 children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket, for what would turn out to be their final meal together as a family. It looked completely ordinary, a father eating with his kids before heading off to work like millions of parents do every single day. But work, for Michael Jackson, meant something different. By late afternoon, he was on his way to the Staples Center in downtown Los Angeles, where his production team had been rehearsing for months. Choreographer Travis Payne later recalled that rehearsals with Jackson would usually start around noon or 1 o'clock at his home, where they'd dance and stretch for a few hours before heading to the arena. That night's rehearsal would become one of the most talked about nights in the entire This Is It production, because it was the first time the team ran the entire show from start to finish. According to magician Ed Alonzo, who was part of the production, Jackson arrived and jokingly complained about his voice before finally taking the stage around 9 p.m. Alonzo later said Jackson looked great and had great energy. For the next several hours, Jackson performed. Not marked through the choreography, performed. He ran through Billie Jean. He ran through Smooth Criminal. He ran through Thriller. Vocal director Dorian Holley later described watching Jackson demonstrate every part of every song to a room full of dancers half his age, saying the team would simply sit there in awe. According to Holley, Jackson could still do everything, though he would sometimes mention afterward how sore it left him. AEG executive Ken Ehrlich, who was present that night, remembered Jackson cracking jokes, feeling upbeat, and looking like a man who was on his way to giving a great performance. Nobody in that building had any reason to believe this was the last time they'd ever see him dance. The rehearsal ran past midnight. Around 1 a.m., Jackson's car pulled back into the driveway of the Carrollwood Drive mansion. He went upstairs to his bedroom on the first floor, where a man was already waiting for him. That man was Dr. Conrad Murray, Jackson's personal physician, hired earlier that year specifically to help him get through the physical demands of tour preparation. The arrangement was unusual by any medical standard. Murray was reportedly being paid roughly $150,000 a month, and he was essentially on call around the clock, living inside Jackson's world, rather than simply treating him during office visits. Jackson had suffered from chronic insomnia for years, a fact confirmed repeatedly by people close to him. Whatever exhaustion, adrenaline, and physical strain came from that night's full-scale rehearsal, none of it was enough to let him sleep naturally. And so, as he had on many nights before, Jackson turned to Murray for help. What happened over the next 9.5 hours would later be reconstructed piece by piece through a police affidavit, phone records, witness statements, and Murray's own testimony, because Murray was the only other person in that room. Murray began, according to his later account to investigators, with 2 milligrams of the sedative lorazepam after an earlier dose of Valium had done nothing. Jackson still could not sleep. Over the following hours, Murray continued administering a rotating combination of sedatives, Valium, then lorazepam, then midazolam, each one failing to bring on real sleep. According to Murray's later account, Jackson grew increasingly desperate as the night went on, at one point reportedly telling him, in essence, that he simply needed to sleep no matter what it took. By the early morning hours, none of the standard sedatives had worked. Jackson, according to accounts later presented in court, told Murray that other doctors in the past had used propofol, a powerful surgical anesthetic, not a sleep aid, and never intended to be used outside a hospital operating room, to knock him out for 15 to 18 hours at a time. Murray had reportedly grown concerned in the weeks prior that Jackson had developed a dependency on the drug, which Jackson sometimes nicknamed his milk. Murray later told investigators he had begun trying to wean Jackson off it just days before, saying, 3 days before his death, I started to wean Mr. Jackson from propofol. But that night, after hours of failed attempts with safer alternatives, and after what Murray described as repeated demands from an exhausted, desperate Jackson, Murray gave in. By mid-morning on June 25th, the sun was already up over Holmby Hills. Somewhere in that mansion, Jackson's children were likely still asleep, unaware their father had been awake fighting for rest all night just down the hall. At approximately 10:40 a.m., according to the chronology Murray gave police, he administered 25 milligrams of propofol into Jackson's IV drip. Finally, after a night of failed sedatives, restlessness, and exhaustion, Michael Jackson fell asleep. Murray stayed by his side for about 10 minutes, watching him rest. Then he made a decision that would be scrutinized for years to come. He left the room to use the bathroom. He was gone for less than 2 minutes. When Murray came back into the bedroom, Michael Jackson was not breathing. What happened over the next hour has been debated in courtrooms, newsrooms, and living rooms around the world for over a decade, because the timeline simply doesn't add up the way it should. Phone records show Murray made at least 3 calls between 11:18 a.m. and 11:51 a.m., while, according to prosecutors, Jackson lay unresponsive. Those calls were not to 911. It wasn't until approximately 12:20 to 12:21 p.m. that emergency services were finally contacted. By the time paramedics arrived, they found Jackson in cardiac arrest, and the details of how CPR was being administered raised even more questions. The recording of the 911 call, released the following day, described Murray performing chest compressions on a soft mattress rather than moving Jackson to the floor, which is standard emergency protocol because a soft surface drastically reduces the effectiveness of compressions. Paramedics worked on him at the scene and continued efforts en route to Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center. But according to emergency room doctors who later testified at trial, by the time Michael Jackson arrived at the hospital, he was already clinically dead. Dr. Thao Nguyen, one of the ER physicians who treated him, later testified that Murray sounded desperate and looked devastated, and that the team attempted resuscitation largely because Murray insisted on it, even though, in her assessment, there was almost no hope left. Revealed, 2 ER doctors reportedly believed the effort to save him was already futile. But they kept trying anyway, because the man begging them not to stop was the same man who had been alone with him when it happened. At 2:26 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, Michael Jackson was pronounced dead. He was 50 years old. Within minutes, the news began to spread, and it spread faster than almost anything the internet had ever carried before. Twitter, still a relatively new platform in 2009, reportedly crashed under the volume of people searching his name. Websites like TMZ and CNN saw a traffic spike so massive their servers struggled to keep up. Fans gathered outside the hospital, outside his family's home in Encino, outside the Apollo Theater in New York, outside the gates of Neverland Ranch, the place most associated with his legacy, even though he hadn't lived there in years. For millions of people around the world, it felt personal, because in some way, Michael Jackson had been part of nearly everyone's life. He wasn't just a celebrity, he was the soundtrack to childhoods, weddings, family gatherings, first dances. And now he was gone, in a way that felt shockingly sudden for a man who, just hours earlier, had been dancing through Thriller like it was still 1983. Revealed, the same night, hundreds of fans had been rehearsing outside the O2 Arena in London, hoping to catch even a glimpse of the comeback everyone had waited 12 years for. The star they were waiting to see had already died on another continent. The Los Angeles County Department of Medical Examiner coroner would later rule Jackson's death an accidental homicide caused by acute propofol intoxication, with the sedatives lorazepam and midazolam listed as contributing factors. The official ruling classified it as a case of medical malpractice. A death caused not by illness or age, but by the combination of drugs administered to him that night, under conditions nowhere close to the hospital environment where propofol is meant to be used. In November 2011, Dr. Conrad Murray was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison and was released after serving just under 2 years. But beyond the courtroom, beyond the headlines, what the case revealed was something far more uncomfortable. A 50-year-old man, one of the most famous human beings who had ever lived, had been so desperate for rest, so worn down by decades of performance, pressure, and public expectation, that he had been receiving a surgical anesthetic in his own bedroom almost every night, just to close his eyes for a few hours. Revealed. The most famous entertainer on the planet couldn't get something as basic as sleep without medical intervention, and almost nobody around him stopped to ask if that was actually normal. To understand how it got to this point, you have to understand what Michael Jackson was carrying in the months before his death. It wasn't just a concert series. It was framed by nearly everyone involved, AEG Live, the media, and Jackson himself, as the ultimate comeback. After years of legal battles, financial difficulty, and public scrutiny following his 2005 trial, this was supposed to be the moment the world remembered why they fell in love with him in the first place. 50 sold-out shows at the O2 Arena, rehearsals that stretched late into the night, sometimes 6 days a week. A production this massive, with this much money and reputation riding on it, doesn't leave much room for a 50-year-old body, one that had already endured decades of demanding choreography, old injuries, and the physical wear of a lifetime on stage, to simply say, "I need to rest." And so instead of rest, there was propofol. Instead of a night off, there was another full rehearsal. Instead of someone stepping in to say, "This isn't sustainable," there was a $150,000 a month arrangement that kept the show moving forward. Revealed, the very comeback that was supposed to prove Michael Jackson still had it in him may have been the thing that pushed his body past the point it could recover from. This is where the story stops being about Michael Jackson specifically, and starts being about something much bigger. Here's something that makes this story even harder to sit with. June 25th, 2009, wasn't the first time the people around Michael Jackson had reason to worry about his health. It was simply the last. Back in 1993, in the middle of his Dangerous World Tour, Jackson abruptly canceled the remaining dates and checked himself into treatment, publicly acknowledging a dependency on painkillers that had reportedly begun after he suffered burns during a 1984 Pepsi commercial shoot. An accident that left him relying on medication to manage pain during grueling performance schedules. Even then, more than 15 years before his death, the pattern was already visible. Perform through pain, medicate to keep performing, and repeat, because stopping was never presented as an option. By the time he was preparing This Is It in 2009, that pattern had been running for decades. Friends, family members, and former associates had reportedly voiced concern at different points over the years about his reliance on medication to sleep and to manage the physical toll of performing. Some of those concerns reportedly reached his family directly. Reports at the time suggested his mother, Katherine Jackson, and other relatives had grown worried about his health and his weight loss in the weeks leading up to the tour. Revealed, the warning signs weren't hidden. They were there for over a decade, and every single time the show found a way to go on anyway. That's the part of this story that should genuinely unsettle you. It wasn't that nobody noticed, it's that noticing was never enough to stop the machine that had been built around him. A machine made up of a tour, a contract, a comeback narrative, and millions of fans who had already bought their tickets. While cameras were setting up outside hospitals and fans were gathering at Neverland's gates, Michael Jackson's own family was still trying to process what had happened. His mother, Katherine Jackson, reportedly learned of her son's death not from a phone call from the hospital, but from television reports that had already begun airing before the family had been formally notified in full detail. For a family that had spent Michael's entire life in the public eye, even his death became something the world learned about almost as quickly as they did. His 3 children, Prince, 12, Paris, 11, and Blanket, just 7 years old, had eaten breakfast with their father less than 24 hours earlier. They were now, suddenly, the center of a custody question, a media storm and a grief process playing out with the entire planet watching. Paris Jackson would later speak publicly, years afterward, about how disorienting and painful that period was, losing a parent while the rest of the world treated the loss as a headline rather than a family's private tragedy. Revealed. For most families, losing a father means grieving in private. For Michael Jackson's children, it meant grieving while news vans camped outside their gate. In the months after Jackson's death, the investigation into Dr. Conrad Murray intensified. Detectives seized medical equipment from the Carrollwood Drive mansion, including bags of propofol, IV bags, and oxygen tanks, equipment more commonly found in an operating room than a bedroom. Murray was formally charged with involuntary manslaughter in February 2010. His trial, which began in September 2011, became one of the most closely watched celebrity court cases in American history, broadcast live and dissected in real time by news networks around the world. During the trial, Murray's own recorded police interview, taped just 2 days after Jackson's death, was played in open court. In it, Murray described the night in painstaking detail: the failed sedatives, Jackson's growing desperation, and finally the decision to administer propofol. He told investigators he believed he was trying to wean the singer off the drug that killed him, not administering a fatal dose. The prosecution argued something very different: that Murray had been negligent in multiple ways, administering a surgical anesthetic in a home setting with no proper monitoring equipment, leaving Jackson unattended after sedating him, and failing to call 911 immediately when he discovered Jackson unresponsive. On November 7, 2011, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Murray was sentenced to 4 years in prison and had his medical license revoked. He was released after serving just under 2 years, citing overcrowding and good behavior. For many fans, the sentence felt like it barely scratched the surface of what had actually happened, because the trial, by design, could only judge one man's actions on one night. It could never put an entire industry, an entire pressure system, an entire culture of "the show must go on" trial. 10 weeks after Jackson's death, Sony Pictures released a documentary compiled from rehearsal footage, shot in the weeks before he died. Footage that had been intended purely as a behind-the-scenes archive for the tour itself. Titled "This Is It," the film gave the world something it desperately wanted: one more chance to watch him move, one more chance to see the show that never happened. Audiences who watched it saw exactly what his crew had seen: a performer who, despite everything happening behind the scenes, still moved with a precision and energy that looked, on camera, almost impossible for a man in his physical condition. The footage became, for millions of fans, both a celebration and a haunting reminder of everything that was lost. The film went on to become one of the highest-grossing documentary concert films in history. Proof, in the most bittersweet way possible, that the comeback the world had been waiting for was real. It simply never got to happen on a real stage. Revealed, the rehearsals that were supposed to prepare Michael Jackson for the greatest tour of his life became, instead, the last recorded footage the world would ever have of him, a farewell nobody knew they were filming. On July 7, 2009, a memorial service was held at the Staples Center, the very arena where Jackson had rehearsed just weeks earlier. An estimated 31.1 million people in the United States alone watched the broadcast, with hundreds of millions more tuning in around the world, making it one of the most watched events in television history at the time. His daughter, Paris Jackson, then just 11 years old, stood in front of the world and, through tears, said she wanted everyone to know her father was the best father you could ever imagine, a moment that instantly became one of the most emotional in memorial television history. Fans gathered not just in Los Angeles, but in cities across the globe: Tokyo, London, Johannesburg, Sao Paulo, holding candlelight vigils, playing his music in public squares, and dancing his choreography in the streets as a form of tribute. For a moment, the entire planet seemed to move to the same rhythm one last time. Even now, more than a decade later, people still argue over one central question: was Michael Jackson a victim of a negligent doctor? Or was he a man who spent years engineering his own access to drugs he knew were dangerous, using his money and status to bypass the boundaries a normal patient would never be allowed to cross? The honest answer, based on everything that came out during the investigation and trial, is that it was probably both at once. Murray was found legally responsible for the specific medical decisions made on the night of June 24th into June 25th. The improper setting, the lack of monitoring equipment, the decision to leave his patient alone after administering a surgical anesthetic. But the broader pattern that led to that night, the years of insomnia, the history of medication dependency, the immense pressure of a career built on being flawless, belonged to a system far bigger than one doctor. AEG Live, the promoter behind This Is It, was later sued by Jackson's mother, Catherine, who argued the company had recklessly hired and retained Murray despite warning signs. A civil jury in 2013 ultimately found AEG had hired Murray competently, though the case itself kept a difficult question in the public eye for years. How many people around a person like Michael Jackson had the power to say, "Stop"? And why didn't any of them use it? Revealed. In the entire chain of people surrounding Michael Jackson in his final months, his doctor, his promoters, his management, his own inner circle, not one of them was ever in a position, or willing, to simply tell him to stop and rest before it was too late. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire story. It's not just about one doctor's decisions in one bedroom. It's about an entire ecosystem built around a superstar that made stopping feel impossible, even when everyone around him could see he desperately needed to. Here's what almost nobody says when they talk about this story. Michael Jackson's death wasn't caused by a single bad decision on a single night. It was the final result of years, decades, of ignoring the most basic signal the human body sends: I need to stop. He ignored it because the world needed him to keep performing. He ignored it because a $150,000 a month doctor made it easier to ignore. He ignored it because rest, in his world, had somehow become something you had to earn, something you weren't allowed to take until the tour was over, until the album was finished, until the comeback was complete. And maybe that sounds extreme to you. Maybe you're thinking, I'm not a global superstar preparing for 50 sold-out shows. But ask yourself honestly, how many nights this month have you told your own body, not yet, I'll rest later? How many times have you pushed through exhaustion because stopping felt like falling behind? Michael Jackson had access to the best doctors, the best resources, the best of everything money could buy. And none of it saved him because none of it addressed the actual problem. The problem was never a lack of resources. The problem was a refusal, by him and by everyone around him, to let him stop. So let me say this as clearly as I can. You can be the most talented person in the room. You can be the hardest worker anyone has ever met. You can have the biggest dream, the tightest deadline, the loudest voice telling you, don't stop now. But your body does not care about your deadline. Your body does not care about your reputation. Your body only understands one thing, limits. And when you cross them long enough, it will eventually force you to stop, one way or another. Michael Jackson taught the entire world how to dance. He taught the entire world how to dream bigger than anyone thought possible. But in his final hours, without meaning to, he also taught the world something else. Something far more important than any dance move or any chart record. You are allowed to slow down. You are allowed to say, not tonight. You are allowed to protect your body the same way you protect your dreams. Because without your body, there's no dream left to chase. The tragedy of June 25th, 2009, wasn't just that the world lost the king of pop. It's that somewhere along the way, everyone around him, his team, his doctor, even Jackson himself, stopped treating exhaustion like a warning sign and started treating it like an obstacle to push through. Don't make that same mistake with your own life.